Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Taliban continue to gain territory in Afghanistan. In the past week, Taliban have overrun areas bordering 5 countries, Pakistan, China, Iran, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan, as foreign troops continue their withdrawal. These include Spin Boldak, Sher Khan Bandar, Islam Qila, and Turgandi. Pesh battles between Taliban fighters and Afghan government forces are also underway in the northern Balkh province, which borders Uzbekistan. In at least 2 cases, Afghan security forces crossed over into Tajikistan and Iran to save their lives. While the domestic security situation for President Ashraf Ghani's government continues to deteriorate, Ghani inaugurated an airport in Khost and asked the Taliban to not accept the internationally recognized border with Pakistan. Meanwhile, a Taliban delegation in Moscow told Russia's special presidential representative for Afghanistan, Zamir Kabulov, that the Taliban would not violate the borders of the Central Asian countries and also guaranteed the safety of diplomatic and consular missions in Afghanistan. To discuss the situation further, joined by Dr. Kamran Bukhari, Director of Analytical Development at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, Dr. Ilhan Niaz, author and Assistant Professor of History at Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad, and Musharraf Zaidi, Founder and Senior Fellow, Tabad-Lab, a think tank in Islamabad. Let me begin with Dr. Kamran Bukhari here. Kamran, so let's get a review of the situation as it stands. Obviously, it's evolving at a pretty rapid pace, and then we can get into certain specifics.
So, Ejaz, I think in your initial opening report, you laid out the latest. And I would add to that by saying all of these areas are far-flung, remote areas on the periphery of the country with various borders touching various countries all around pretty much like a, if you will, a 180 degrees angle. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that, these are spots where the government's writ was weak to begin with because they faced no resistance, did not mean that they had a robust presence, much less ability to defend these areas if and when challenged. And now they're being challenged, and now we're seeing them fall. So I don't think anybody who's been following Afghanistan should be surprised about this. Yes, it's making waves and headlines, and the speed at which it is happening, and by design, the Taliban designed it this way, is to basically shape perceptions all across the world. The key thing to watch moving forward is when will they assault larger urban centers? And that's where they're going to run into the resistance from the Afghan National Security Forces. And that's where the United States will have to decide whether or not to provide close air support to Afghan security forces. So I think that that's right now they're gobbling up, if you will, as much territory as possible so that they can shape perceptions, basically hit the morale of the other side and create this perception of invincibility so as to get a lot of people to just drop their weapons, either go home or join them. And that's how the chessboard is being set up.
Okay. Now, this is without prejudice saying we already know that in the south and southeast, which are the Taliban strongholds, they more or less control most of at least 90% of the territory. But it seems to me, and this is purely, and you know, your point about perception is very perceptive, I would say. In military operational terms, it's a physical battle also, it's a psychological battle also. But the important point is, and I want to take your quick, take on this. These are areas where the Taliban have never really been strong. So you made a point that the government forces were thin in these areas, but that's also true of the Taliban. We've also heard that they have been picking up cadres from Tajiks and Uzbeks in heavy Tajik areas. So they're also creating a ring, and that that kind of dovetails with the point you made with reference to perceptions. So is that something that you find significant in operational terms, creating a sort of ring around?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that is the most important element in all of the activity that we've seen so far. So number one is they have gone into areas, and this didn't happen like last week or last month or even last year. I've been following this as far back as at least 2016, when a half a dozen districts in Badakhshan province, which is the northernmost province that borders China and Tajikistan, they were being taken over. The Taliban at least had freedom of movement there, if not complete control. This was 5 years ago. So they've been at it for quite a long time. There's a method to the madness here. They do not want to be able to leave room for the other side, which is dominated by the Tajiks, because the Tajiks make up roughly 25 to 30% of the population, second behind the Pashtuns. And the Taliban being, as you noted earlier, its core turf is in the Pashtun majority areas in the south and in the east. So this is where they anticipated that they would face resistance. So they're trying to go after them. And in the process, what they've done is they have essentially incorporated people from the minority communities. I've even heard that there are a few commanders, not many, a handful maybe at most, who are, from a sectarian point of view, Shia as well. So this is interesting, and it is not something that they did on their own. They had help, and the help came from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, whose current commander, who succeeded Qasem Soleimani last year, a year and a half ago, his portfolio is Afghanistan. So the current commander of the IRGC-QF is an expert on Afghanistan. So he comes to the job, and it comes at a time when Afghanistan is cooking.
Absolutely. I think that's a very important point. Dr. Ilhan Niaz, let's talk about what you think of the situation, evolving situation in Afghanistan, but more importantly, how do you think it's likely to impact Pakistan?
The first thing is that there is an element of predictability to what comes next. Many people who've been following the conflict in Afghanistan have long warned of the futility of the American military intervention and have long been worried about what will happen when that intervention eventually winds down. Yet at the same time, what we are seeing is that neighboring countries, including Pakistan, don't appear to have thought very clearly forward about what they will do in the event of a major escalation in internal violence in Afghanistan, and how exactly are they going to respond to a situation where a host of actors, not just the Taliban, but others as well, that might be perceived as inimical to the interests of one or another regional power, are likely to find greater space or greater support. So this is again something which all of the powers need to be worried about. Pakistan, of course, is the one that is likely to be worst affected by the resumption of large-scale conflict in Afghanistan, and therefore has the greatest stakes, if you will, in ensuring that either that type of escalation does not happen, or that if that type of escalation does happen, then Pakistan has options in dealing with the resulting disruption.
So I'm going to get back to the options part of it. But let me pull in Musharraf Zaidi, who's been listening in on this. Musharraf, your initial thoughts. I know you did that Tabadla session, which had KB also. I was also there. So we've been discussing a lot of this. We have discussed a lot of this already. But things are changing at a pace which is rather, lightning, if I would say, in the manner that places are falling to the Taliban. But so that, and then also, because I'm trying to be a little mischievous here, and you know why, a word about Ghani's internationally recognized / Durand Line comment also.
I, of course, always enjoy a little bit of mischief, especially when there's two Bukharis in the room, no matter the scholar gentleman from Kazim University as an arbiter of this exchange. Look, I think, first of all, nothing much to say that hasn't been said by Dr. Bukhari or Dr. Niaz. The speed at which various districts in Afghanistan are falling is, I don't think, entirely surprising. I also think that it's easy to take the numbers and inflate them in terms of their importance. 85% of the geographic territory is not 85% of the population. None of the city centers have been taken over. And I continue to believe that the assumption that this pace will be sustained over the next, essentially, maybe four months before the winter sort of slog kicks in, I think is possible, but in my estimation, unlikely. President Ghani, Hamdullah Mohib, the National Security Advisor, Amrullah Saleh, the Vice President, it's not a short list of desperate individuals in Kabul. The first and easiest go-to to provoke and prompt overly aggressive posturing and unnecessary responses from Pakistan, it's needling Pakistan. The Durand Line is but one. Over the last several weeks, we've seen repeated attempts by Afghan officials to engage in a diatribe-based, personalized, negative and toxic exchange with Pakistanis, especially Pakistani officials. Pakistanis should not take the bait. Because it is an internationally recognized border, the euphemism or the moniker of Durand Line should not be an irritant for anyone. Pakistan is a very large, very strong country. The more that it reacts in response to these kinds of provocations, the easier the fifth generation war that's being imposed on it becomes for Pakistan's enemies to wage against it, often from the safe distances afforded to them by the battlefield that is Afghanistan and the proxies that act on Pakistan's enemies' behalf.
Okay. So let me take this to Dr. Ilhan Niaz. Dr. Ilhan Niaz, Musharraf is saying that Pakistan should not take the bait. But he has also said that this is part of the, fifth generation warfare or hybrid war, or call it what you will. In which case, one needs to figure out which party. I mean, we recognize the Kabul government. It also has a seat in the United Nations. The space is now being contested. So let's see who wins it, or whether no one actually wins, clearly. So what are our options in terms of, should we wait for the spillover into our territory and then respond, or should we preempt?
Well, I think if you simply hunker down behind the fence and hope that somehow Afghan political actors will be able to get some sort of agreement, then that is being overly optimistic. And the reason for that is that since 1973, the Afghan political elite and various factions have been overthrowing and killing each other in various combinations. And they have been doing so in the presence of international powers like the Soviets or later the Americans. And they have also been doing so in the absence of such powers. Unfortunately, while Afghanistan may still be one country, it no longer possesses a workable consensus on it being one state. And that is something which can possibly take many, many generations to work out. Pakistan obviously does not have the ability to stabilize Afghanistan by itself. It does not have the ability to attempt doing what superpowers were not able to do. All that Pakistan can really do is hope that these Afghan political leaders will finally come to their senses and decide that it is not worthwhile to destroy their country in an attempt to achieve complete government over it. But this is a wisdom that has eluded several generations now of Afghan leaders, and it does not seem that it has as yet dawned upon them that this is perhaps not a sustainable way forward. Of course, if in the absence of even a notional effective government in Afghanistan, Afghanistan's territory starts to be used against Pakistan, or Pakistan faces a major influx of refugees as it has earlier, then Pakistan will have to think about how to respond. And whether it responds by trying to keep the refugees on the Afghan side of the border, or whether it responds by, as you suggested in your articles, launching a series of aggressive but limited counterterrorism operations aimed at disrupting those elements that are especially inimical to Pakistan's interests, then that is, of course, a question that Pakistani policymakers will have to take up. But in what comes ahead, unfortunately, there are no really good options. There are only options that we can argue whether one is bad or the other is worse, or one is necessary or the other is avoidable.
Absolutely, that's a fantastic way of putting it. But before I go to Kamran, I want to get your take, Ilhan, on another issue. Since you mentioned my article, Musharraf, as you know, responded to that, and I believe Musharraf has another one coming out tomorrow. There's the issue of sovereignty. Now, as a political science student, when we talk about sovereignty, then it's one, trait or one element or one characteristic of a state, and it requires that in a territory, in a given territory where there's a collection of people, there's a government, and that government actually has its writ. If the space is socio-politically, ethnically, and in many other ways being contested, I want to get your take as a historian on how you would look at the issue of sovereignty in such a situation.
Well, if you look at sovereignty historically, then in our part of the world, as well as in many other parts of the world, the default model for organizing sovereignty was an empire in which one group of people dominated many others. And in those areas where their domination weakened, they would face confrontation from other potential empires or other potential entities. So sovereignty might be a good thing from the perspective of a political science textbook, but it is really a concept that has fluctuated greatly in accordance with the ability of a state to actually enforce its claims over a territory. And what history teaches us is that when a state, for a prolonged period of time, is unable to maintain a bare minimum field control, then it is almost inevitable that other actors, both internal and external, will start to fill that vacuum. So in that sense, if a vacuum is likely to emerge, or indeed has already emerged, then that is the reality that Pakistani policymakers should be focusing on, not some theoretical or abstract notions of what constitutes sovereignty. Certainly, other countries in the world only use sovereignty to the extent that it is convenient for them to do so, and they discard it whenever their national interests or their strategic interests demand them to take a more elastic view.
Okay. Imran Bukhari, this is a very interesting way of looking at it. So give me your sense of how you look at Pakistan's options with reference to Afghanistan's sovereignty. A very interesting point that Ilhan made about the empires. And the empires expanded, and then at points they weakened. And, in that sense, until the 18th century, mid-18th century, Afghanistan was actually being contested, from the Indian side, the Mughals, the Safavids, and from the Central Asian side also. So from that historical perspective, and given today's situation, where do you think Afghanistan is likely headed?
I think that Ijaz, Afghanistan is going to remain a pressure cooker for a long time to come. I mean, we keep talking about that it's been 40 years of civil war. That's true, but in 40 years, not a whole lot has happened to end the fighting. The fighting is continuing. So I think Ilhan is right. We're looking at a multi-generational process here. Many years ago, I presented a paper at a conference, and I basically argued that there is no social contract in Afghanistan on the idea of what does Afghan nationalism look like. So there are multiple competing ideas. And this isn't, at the time, this was something novel. And the Iraq war had just begun. And we're now seeing this in Iraq as well. As the Sunnis have a certain view of what Iraqi nationalism looks like, and the Shia have a different one, and the Kurds, and we can go on the list. So this is something that's, the nation state borders that were erected, in the early 20th century, they, are collapsing. And then we're seeing this across the Middle East and South Asia. And so the idea that there's some sovereignty becomes very textbookish, because then there's a reality on the ground that when there is no consensus, there's a lack of consensus on what a certain sovereignty, a certain social contract, a certain form of nationalism means for various groups within a country, within a territory, then it creates a situation for neighboring countries and all other parties to the conflict to take actions that they would otherwise not do. Because in, let's say, use the word normal, for a lack of a better term, in normal circumstances, in the world that we live in, sovereignty is inviolable. You don't violate sovereignty. There are extenuating circumstances that lead to that. I mean, we can go back to the years when there was intense drone strikes in Pakistan, and this was a huge issue. Pakistan's sovereignty is being violated. That was Islamabad's point of view. Washington would countermand and say, look, you guys don't impose your writ in the area, and therefore we have to take care of threats that you can't. That debate went back and forth, and the drone strikes continue. So moving forward, I think that, look, it won't be just Pakistan, because there's a balancing act that even the Iranians are playing. If you go back to the meeting that was organized by Jawad Zarif, the foreign minister, between representatives of the Taliban movement and representatives of the Afghan government and other anti-Taliban factions. What are they trying to achieve? They're trying to achieve some form of a balance, if you will. I mean, peace is too, if you will, elusive of a concept. I won't go there, but at least a balance in the battlefield where this thing is manageable. Now, I can even see them engaging in cross-border strikes if it comes to it. So, your concept of Pakistan, your idea that you presented in your paper about Pakistan doing that. So this isn't something that's something major. This becomes a natural response as and when needed, because there's nobody to call up and say, hey, can you take care of this? So you take care of it yourself. Now the question is, if you take care of it yourself, with frequency, then that creates a slippery slope. Pakistan gets dragged in to a conflict that it may not necessarily want to go. So my view is that there is a window of opportunity right now. And that window of opportunity And there are no permanent enemies or friends, as Lord Palmerston, the 19th century British statesman, so eloquently put it. There are only permanent interests. So the permanent interest of Pakistan is that Afghanistan should not become a place that threatens Pakistan. How do you achieve that? That can change over time, and that's unfortunately something Islamabad has been weak on, with the heavy tilt towards the Taliban, historically speaking. But now I think it's time to sort of move into the center and say, okay, is it in our interest? Is it in Pakistan's interest to allow the anti-Taliban camp to be defeated? I don't think so. But then I'm not a Pakistani policymaker, so I'll leave it to them.
Right. That's a very interesting point. I know that you made it on my program also. You made this point on Musharraf's Tabadla session also. But frankly, before I go to Musharraf, one thing about the American drone strikes, unbeknown to the Pakistanis at that time, lots of those strikes were, the government of Pakistan was in on those strikes. And then, of course, the signature strikes began, and by then, relations had nosedived. And the American argument with reference to ungoverned spaces was pretty disingenuous, in the sense that Pakistan had deployed a number of troops there, and it was conducting a number of military operations, which is not the case, or which is not the capacity that even the U.S. NATO troops manifested in Afghanistan, and certainly not the present Afghan government. Musharraf Zaidi, you've heard Ilhan, you've heard Kamran. So give me your thoughts about the issue of sovereignty, the issue of contested spaces, and of course, the possibility of a spillover.
So let me start with the spillover, Ijaz, and just say that I don't think the question of a possibility of a spillover is a question. There is already a spillover. There are at least 3 dozen, closer to 4 dozen Pakistani soldiers that have been killed by the TTP and TTP adjacent groups over the last quarter. The second war on terror for Pakistan has already begun. This is not a future tense sort of an issue. We are in the midst of this second war on terror. I think part of the reason why both you and I have engaged in this debate as enthusiastically as we have is not so much because of the substance of the debate, because if I'm honest with you, it's as you rightly have pointed out in your latest piece, A, nobody has any conclusive answers, and B, the question of cross-border kinetics is one amongst a whole menu of options. My taking objection or my taking issue with that specific element of the menu of options and the menu of ideas that you presented in your first piece was really about establishing one red line from me. That if that's not something that you and I share, that's fine. What's more important is that as this second war on terror in Pakistan begins, what kind of depth and breadth are the issues being discussed with? And in the piece that I've written in response to your second piece, Ijaz, what I've tried to do is move away from a tit for tat debate, because so much of what you've written both in your first and your second piece, one agrees with, and you've made that you've noted that. I think what's more important is to examine the context. I found it really interesting that Ilhan Niaz, started by maybe a gentle kind of contempt for optimism, but then framed the future as one of hope, that Pakistani policymakers have to hope. And I think that optimism and hope is being banked on, particularly and specifically in this instance, because we've watched this movie play out multiple times. Kamran Bukhari said that states have permanent interests. The big question for Pakistani policymakers, and I don't have an answer to this, but I pose this to your viewers and to anybody that's watching, and of course to you, Ijaz. The big question we have to ask is 40 years, actually since 1979, it's now 42 years since this conflict really begun. Its costs on Pakistan and its society have been enormous. There's no denying that. There's no analysis that says that the Afghanistan conundrum has not had massive social, political, and economic costs for Pakistan. In these 42 years, who has been tending to Pakistan's interests, and have they been served? And if we can't answer those questions with clear answers, and I don't think we can, then we're in a lot of trouble as we try and grapple with the current conundrum, which is not a new one, but a continuum of one that has a 42-year-old history.
Right. I've all run out of time, so very quickly, Ilhan, in a couple of minutes, if you could say something about the conundrum that Musharraf is talking about, with reference to how much of this is endogenous and how much of it is exogenous, where Pakistan is simply reacting to events created by actors other than itself.
Well, I mean, I think it is fairly clear that Pakistan would not have had any control over Brezhnev's decision to invade Afghanistan in light of the Soviet foreign policy doctrine of that time. And it is really that invasion that gravely escalates the internal conflict and sets the stage for much of the subsequent conflicts that we are seeing play out. So in that sense, Pakistan has had to react to what countries far more powerful than itself, starting with the Soviet Union, and then, of course, over the last 20 years, the United States and its allies have sought to achieve in Afghanistan. In between these interventions, Pakistan has attempted to have some kind of an independent policy as far as Afghanistan is concerned. So again, when it comes to fostering a policy for the future, Pakistan's options, what it can do, are really quite limited. And that is something which Pakistani policymakers will have to grapple with.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Ilhan Niaz. Thank you to Musharraf Zaidi. Thank you to Kamran Bukhari, as always. We shall take a short break and return to discuss fears expressed by National Command Operations Center of a fourth COVID-19 wave in Pakistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. The Delta variant is in Pakistan. It first appeared in India and was known as the Indian variant. We do know that the Delta variant is highly transmissible, and several countries are battling new waves of this variant. Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, Russia, and countries in South America are dealing with the Delta variant breakouts. The World Health Organization has declared it the most contagious of all coronavirus variants. It has now been identified in 85 countries. The National Command Operations Center in Pakistan has expressed fears that this variant could lead to a fourth wave in Pakistan. Statistics show a threefold rise in new cases as people throw caution to the wind and flout non-vaccine safety protocols. To discuss this further, I'm by Dr. Samia Altaf, a physician and public health specialist, currently associated with the Lahore University of Management Sciences, and Sawail Hussain, economist and CEO of Syed Engineers. Let me begin with Sawail here. Sawail, you're the number cruncher. You've been doing this, since this COVID-19 pathogen started its deadly march. And I believe last time you were on my program, you were quite optimistic about the fact that we've almost defeated it. You also talked about vaccination and the rest of it. So what are your thoughts now with reference to what NCOC is saying and what the statistics are showing?
First of all, there has been an uptick, a significant uptick in the last week or so. Positivity rate has increased from about 2% to about 3.8 today. So there is clearly, a rise. However, with the Delta variant, we have to understand that while it is more transmissible, it's by some estimates, it's twice as transmissible as the original coronavirus, the COVID virus. It can be, defeated by vaccines. So vaccines are effective. We have good data on that. globally. And what the vaccines do at a minimum is that it prevents, the COVID virus from making one seriously ill. So that's at a bare minimum. So what Pakistan needs to do at this point is to ramp up the vaccination drive. We've currently, administered about 20 million doses, but we need to ramp this up and get to 100 million. I have written previously, also published on this, that Pakistan needs a smart vaccination strategy. And by smart, I mean we need to focus on the high-risk groups, which are the 45 years and above. And we need to focus on the urban areas. The total number of people in these age cohorts in the urban areas are about 20 to 25 million. So we should be able to, as a priority, cover and vaccinate these people. And if we are able to do so, then we can continue to get on with our lives and not let this virus, rule over us.
Okay. Dr. Samia Altaf, we've been discussing this virus for a long time. We also discussed this Delta variant, I believe, with you last time you were on the program. So as Savail says, there is a rise. He's also talking about ramping up vaccination, and he has, in fact, in his article, last article, he talked about smart vaccination strategies. So give me your sense of what you think of this uptick, and what are the remedies for this?
Just what one thinks of the is that this was to be expected. This is how coronaviruses behave. So this should not be a surprise. In fact, if we are sensible, we should anticipate what the problems are going to be ahead and start planning for them. And of course, the variants are unpredictable, and this one is very infective. And I'm now getting some information that the clinical presentation of this infection is also a little bit different from the previous ones. So all of those things are expected. What we need to do about it is that I'm just going to go back to the same thing, that we need to address the fundamentals of the system. We can take one piece and try to fix it and say, well, we need to have a smart strategy for vaccinations. We need a smart strategy for lockdowns. We need a smart strategy for communication. So what we come down to is that we need a smart, whatever that means. We need a strategy to deal with, in a comprehensive fashion, with this whole infection, which is in many ways quite predictable that this is what is likely to happen. Some of those things we don't know, but some of the things we know. For example, today I got frantic calls from Islamabad that the NIH center, which is the center for testing and for vaccination, is closed down because of a strike of the people who work there. Why was that a strike? I called one of the persons they said, well, they haven't been paid in the last 11 months that they have been working, almost full time around the clock. The government had promised, and it seems what they are telling me is it seems that the money has been made available to the Department of Health, and the Department of Health has not disbursed that money yet. One can understand that there are a lot of problems and snafus in the administrative system, but that this kind of a thing already there is a lack of seriousness amongst the public about this, and these kind of issues do not inculcate a lot of trust. So I come back to the same thing again and again, that we need to really have a fundamental look at what is the larger systemic issues that need to be handled. And it is important that we deal with the crisis also as it happens. But unless we fix the fundamentals, we will keep, it will continue to be an issue of the tail wagging the dog. We will be kind of dragged along with this crisis or that crisis. But to me, it seems that unless those fundamentals are addressed, there needs to be a consistent strategy for the overall comprehensive dealing with this whole issue, in which a communication and education strategy of the public is very, very important. Because unless the consumer participates with you and follows the SOPs, they will only follow if they understand that what it means for them. You know, executive fiat of closing down this part or that part or holding this person, putting them in jail or, you know, fining them is not likely to work. For large public health interventions, these kind of things do not work. It has to be a fundamental participation of the consumer population. And for that, there are strategies that can be brought. Unfortunately, this government is not focusing on it.
That's an interesting point that I want to take to Savail. But essentially what you're saying is that A, we cannot have a piecemeal approach to strategizing. And secondly, it's not just about firefighting, which is, of course, important because things, happen, the situation evolves. But one needs to sort of, project into the future and work out for the, structural constraints or structural reasons that we need to address the issue. Savail, Dr. Altaf has also talked about the fact that this whole business of punishments is not going to work. And I also refer to some criticism that has come in the wake of, presumably a Sindh government directive that travel will now have to be on the basis of whether the person has been vaccinated. Now, the critics are saying that this is going to open up floodgates of spurious vaccination drives and the rest of it. So there are a number of issues that have been talked about. So give me your sense of what you think about that.
First of all, I think that I agree with Dr. Altaf that we need a comprehensive strategy. And in my article, I have tried to, elucidate that. So basically what we need to do is to, human beings, whether here or elsewhere, respond to incentives. So we have to have a carrot and stick policy, because we have to realize that this virus, when we are spreading it around, if somebody has it and they are careless, and they go around, they will spread it and they can harm other people, including themselves. So as what we economists like to call it, they generate an externality. So they are inflicting a cost on the wider public by not, isolating or taking various measures to protect themselves. So the state is within its rights to, through a system of incentives and disincentives, influence behavior. And, restricting air travel is one of those. I think it's a sensible step. Countries all over the world have done it, and we also need to do this. But we need to have a broader approach. So the first of all is that we need to have a mass awareness campaign, and we need to leverage social media as well as the electronic and print media to create this awareness, create this buy-in that these vaccinations are safe, they are effective, and they are necessary. Secondly, as I have written earlier, we need to perhaps even consider monetary incentives. So I ran some of the numbers, and if we were to simply use the BISP platform and give, 500 rupees per eligible person over the age of 45 to get vaccinated, it's going to cost us about 20 billion rupees. And that way we can certainly, incentivize people to go and get the shot.
Sorry, I'm interjecting because I'm running out of time. But here's the issue, Savail. Dr. Altaf just talked about the fact that for 11 months, NIH staff has not been paid, even though the money has been given to them, the health department hasn't disbursed it. So there is a problem with, this whole sort of idea of incentivizing people. But the point is taken. I think that's a great point. Very quickly, Dr. Altaf, any last thoughts with reference to what Savail is saying?
You know, the things what economists say, and I have a great deal of respect for them, those sound very good on paper. But I think that one needs to keep in mind the practical application of these things. Remember, the Indira Gandhi government had offered financial incentives for contraceptive services to be accepted by people, and see what happened over there. So, you know, we need to be very careful about financial incentives. And we should really, the question we need to ask Ejaz is that we have been talking about this for almost 15, 16 months now. Why is it that we don't have a comprehensive overarching plan? The government needs help. It is very clear that the government is resource constrained as it should be. It's a poor country. It is poor in resources. It's poor also in human resources. But there are a lot of resources that are available outside of the government. And why is it that the government is not putting together a coherent plan? I think that is what I want people to be thinking about now and offer to help the government.
Okay. So you mentioned that incentives don't work. Savel, very, very briefly, because I have run out of time, you want to respond to what Dr. Altaf has said?
Human beings respond to incentives. The world, all over the world, states are using various measures, everything from giving away free ice cream in China to, giving, free beer in the US. That is happening. Okay, so to imagine that, I certainly agree with her to this extent that we need an, overarching and a comprehensive action plan and a strategy. But to say that we don't respond to incentives, or that the government should not try and influence behavior and then let people run amok, that is simply not possible. And we have to get vaccinated. Like I said, the numbers that we need to reach cover the over 45s. That's about 25 million people in the urban areas. That can be done within 100 days if we were to start inoculating about 500,000 to 700,000 people a day. We're currently at about 450,000. So I think that this is very doable, but we need to have, like Dr. Altaf has also mentioned, a comprehensive plan, and then we need to stick to it.
Right. So much to Dr. Samia Altaf. Thank you to Savel Hossain for his insights. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.